Thank you for having me here at this conference. My name is Thomas Krüssmann. I'm representing New Vision University from Tbilisi, Georgia, and I will speak about South-South cooperation in anti-corruption. Corruption is an important enabler of human rights abuses. A state may have a tough labor law to protect workers, but when the labor inspection is bribed to look the other way, human rights abuses may occur. A government may provide free health care, but when the medical sector is underfunded, doctors may ask bribes for treatment. There are many examples of human rights abuses by third parties behind which the ugly face of corruption is lurking. In the field of business and human rights, conceptualizing the relationship between human rights and corruption is not straightforward. The UNGP, the United Nations Guiding Principles, are silent on the matter. The OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, by contrast, contain a section dedicated to combating bribery and other forms of corruption. Anti-corruption is also recognized in SDG 16 and the UN Global Compact. So we should have every reason to give anti-corruption an important role in the field of business and human rights. In a recent study for the European Parliament on due diligence requirements in the supply chain, I stumbled over the following sentence, and let me quote, "Country reporters were asked to discuss due diligence requirements as they relate to corruption. As is evidenced from the country reports, corruption is commonly regulated at member state level in terms of criminal law and do not ordinarily provide remedies for victims." End of quote. Now, does the fact that corruption is regulated at member state level serve as an excuse here to disregard it? Or is the fact that corruption is commonly considered a victimless crime, whereas human rights abuses obviously have very concrete victims? Is that reason enough to exclude corruption from our consideration? Well, obviously not. Human rights due diligence, as required by the UNGP and the OECD RBC framework, focuses on adverse impacts by business enterprises throughout their operations. Nowadays, this is understood as in the supply chain, taking our inquiry to the sites of extraction of raw materials and production of components, mostly in the countries of the global south. So how are we going to uncover corruption as a most important enabler of such effects? I don't have a perfect solution on this, except by saying that the business and human rights agenda, when viewed through the lens of supply chain management, is inadvertently focusing our attention on so-called home state regulation. In other words, the legal standards from the jurisdictions where the business enterprises are incorporated, often in the global north, often far away from the localities of extraction and production, often under pressures which turn human rights due diligence into a ticking the box exercise. This is obviously not a new observation, and some companies are trying to use tools to develop a more authentic understanding of how their operations impact humans in the global south. Localizing the view on corruption can be achieved by multi-stakeholder initiatives, also by third-party certifiers, and independent audits may play a role as long as there is no fly-in audit. So tentatively, there is an argument to be made that corruption as an enabler of human rights abuses should become more clearly understood when looking at concrete situations in the host states. Incidentally, this coincides with the criticism of countries from the global south and also of critical scholars that putting the UNGP on a national action plan track is giving too much attention to the home states of the global north. Instead, the UNGP should be transformed into a universally binding treaty under international law, with the countries of the Global South sitting at the table with equal rights. However, when we look at the latest draft discussed at the UN Intergovernmental Working Group, we see that corruption is not even mentioned here. This brings me to my final question: whether there is a role for South-South cooperation to fit into this analysis. Back in 2009, the U4 Resource Center published an expert answer on South-South anti-corruption cooperation mechanisms. It identified South-South cooperation as an emerging trend and situated it in regional and sub-regional communities. Nowadays, we see South-South cooperation aspiring to a different format, the BRICS Anti-Corruption Working Group. It is probably fair to say, while placing itself firmly on the foundation of UNCAC, the BRICS member states are aspiring to create a counterweight to the G7 and a world order dominated by the global north. So where better to look for innovative anti-corruption tools rooted in the particular conditions of the global south? The benefit of the BRICS Anti-Corruption Working Group is that it operates outside the logic of global supply chains. It is also not naturally aligned with the OECD, although many of the key member states of the BRICS group are also key partners of the OECD: Brazil, China, India, and South Africa, thus connecting the BRICS states to the RBC framework of the OECD. We may look at this question from the angle of the final document of the recent BRICS Kazan Summit, presented under the title Enhanced Anti-Corruption Cooperation and Recovery and Return of Assets and Proceeds of Corruption, BRICS Common Vision and Joint Action. In this document, BRICS member states reaffirm their commitment to the full and effective implementation of UNCAC. In doing so, member states place an extraordinary emphasis on the recovery and return of assets, as well as the proceeds of corruption. In fact, this is nothing else but China's long-standing focus in the anti-corruption arena. Now, while there is nothing wrong with China using the BRICS anti-corruption agenda to further its national anti-corruption policy, I still would like to put in my 5 cents here. UNCAC's formal structure is an indicator of the fact that it is built on the notion of giving the prevention of corruption a central role. Prosecution and the harmonization of criminal offenses come second. International cooperation and asset recovery come third and fourth, just by enumerating the chapters. What we need, as discussed before, are innovative tools to prevent corruption and to identify it, in particular as an enabler of human rights adverse impacts. You may choose to focus on the dimensions of international cooperation and asset recovery, and this may well be justified within the framework of your national legal system. But my expectation would be that the BRICS member states rise to a new understanding of anti-corruption that would really address the Global South's need for new and fresh approaches. BRICS is uniquely positioned to strengthen South-South cooperation in anti-corruption, but in order to do so, it must focus on prevention and prosecution. In the famous Soviet movie Mimino, there is a line that is known by heart to everyone who grew up in the Soviet Union. I will tell you a clever thing, just don't get offended. We see that with the business and human rights agenda taking a turn towards corporate sustainability due diligence, there is an increasing unwillingness to take the role of corruption as an enabler of human rights violations into account. As my initial quote from the European Parliament study suggests, we're often perfectly happy to see corruption and business and human rights as separate worlds. Home states will not be bothered with corruption in the host states, because there should be legislation in place. Also, we wrongly assume that corruption in the global south does not hurt anybody specifically, so it's outside of the focus on human rights. This is all not very helpful, and I would strongly advocate that we sharpen the perspective of South South cooperation. Here it is that China has an important job to do, and it should use its influence over the BRICS group not to export its national anti corruption policy, but to foster joint efforts in the prevention and prosecution of corruption. Thank you so much.